Mrs. Eleanor Davis slowly made her way through the bustling airport terminal, her cane tapping rhythmically against the hard floor with every careful step. She wasn't in a rush like most of the other travelers who hurried past her, but they were on a mission. Her journey was different. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the handle of her carry-on bag and adjusted the scarf around her neck. The weight of the flight was already pressing on her chest. Even before she boarded the plane, there was always something about the sound of jet engines and the tight spaces that made her uneasy, even more so today. She felt the familiar ache in her knees as she moved closer to the gate. Her thoughts wandered to the last time she had been on a plane with him, her late husband Thomas, how he used to be her rock steady and calm, always there to lift the heavy bags and reassure her everything would be all right now as she was alone. And it was harder than she cared to admit. But this trip had to be made, she had promised herself. She wouldn't miss another family reunion. No matter how difficult it might be, the flight attendants announced that it was time to board, and she shuffled toward the line, trying her best to ignore the stiff pain in her legs. As she inched forward, a woman next to her helped lift her carry-on onto the conveyor belts, smiling kindly at her, but Eleanor barely noticed her gesture. She was too preoccupied with her own discomfort. The crowd at the gate was already beginning to thin out. When she was finally called to board the flight, she didn't want to admit it, but her anxiety started to build. As she approached a small jet bridge connecting her to the airplane, she had hoped for help when she had checked in, but no one had offered any. She had managed to make it this far alone, but the thought of getting to her seat was daunting. She was slower than the others as she rolled her wheelchair down the narrow aisle of the plane, trying not to feel the stares of those already seated. The captain's voice came over the speaker, announcing the flight time and weather, but it barely reached her ears as she focused on her own struggle. Her back hunched slightly as she tried to adjust her legs and settle into the seat that awaited her. As she tried to lift her bag into the overhead compartment, her arms trembled with the effort, and for the first time she felt a swell of frustration rising within her. How had she become so dependent? How had everything changed so quickly after all these years? But before she could think much more about it, a young flight attendant appeared beside her with a polite smile. "Mrs. Davis, I hope you're having a comfortable start to your journey," she said, her voice bright, but Eleanor could see the disinterest in her eyes, as if this was just another routine interaction, nothing more than a checklist. She felt herself shrink a little under her gaze as she asked quietly, "Could you help me with my bag? And perhaps assist me with my seatbelt?" Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, but she didn't care. The flight attendant nodded without hesitation and said, "I'll be right back with you, just need to check on a few other things." And with that she was gone. Eleanor watched as the young woman moved down the aisle, quickly helping the other passengers. Without a second thought, she knew the flight was busy, but the lingering sense of loneliness crept up again. She had hoped for kindness, but it felt like a distant memory. She adjusted herself in the seat once again, her legs aching from the strain. She wondered if perhaps it had all been easier when Thomas was here with her, when things felt lighter. Even the simplest tasks seemed impossible without him. But she couldn't turn back. She would get through this, like she always had. She just hoped that when the flight attendant returned, things would be different. Maybe a little help wouldn't be too much to ask. Maybe this time she wouldn't feel so invisible in a crowded world. Eleanor sat there, her hands resting on her lap, feeling the heat of the seat pressing against her skin as the hum of the plane filled her ears. It was always the same, the soft buzzing of the engines, the smell of air fresheners, the muffled conversations of other passengers. Everything seemed to be happening around her, and yet she felt like she was in a world of her own. She couldn't help but watch as the flight attendant, Carla, moved swiftly down the aisle, helping other passengers. Without hesitation, her hands were quick and efficient as she assisted with the overhead bins, adjusted seatbelts, and offered water and blankets to those around her. But every time she passed Eleanor, her eyes seemed to slide past her just a little too quickly, As if Eleanor wasn't even there, the older woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to get some relief from her aching legs. She had hoped that once the flight was underway, the tension in her chest would ease, but instead it felt heavier with every passing minute. Her mind wandered back to the days when she was younger and full of energy, back when travelling had been an adventure, not something to dread, when she'd have been able to carry her own bags and move without so much as a second thought. But now she was here, a senior woman travelling alone, asking for something so simple as help with her seatbelt and bag. And yet it was being denied with every passing moment. She glanced toward Carla once again, hoping for some sign of recognition, or even a small gesture of kindness. But none came. Instead, Carla walked by again, as if Eleanor didn't exist. At all, the frustration started to build slowly, at first a small seed of irritation, and then it grew like a storm gathering on the horizon. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. But the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Why couldn't they just treat her like anyone else? Was she really invisible? Was it too much to ask for a little respect? She had worked so hard her whole life, had raised a family, helped build communities, and now this was how she was treated, like she didn't matter. Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her throat, the kind that came with unspoken words left unspoken. For too long she had raised her children with love and respect, had always fought for fairness, and yet now it felt like she was fighting alone. The moments seemed to stretch on forever. Carla was busy with a group of passengers, 2 rows ahead of her, and Eleanor finally reached for the call button, a small but desperate attempt to get someone's attention. The light flickered above her head, and she watched as Carla glanced in her direction, then quickly turned away, as if she hadn't seen it. Eleanor's heart sank in that instant. She knew what this was. She wasn't a priority, not in the eyes of this young woman, and it stung more than she cared to admit. For a moment, she thought about calling her family, telling them she wasn't sure she could go on with this trip, that maybe it was too much for her. But then she remembered why she had come all this way. She had promised herself and her children she wouldn't let age slow her down. She had made it through much harder things than this, and she would survive this too. But something about Carla's indifference gnawed at her, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being dismissed, a feeling of being less than nothing. With every step that young woman took away from her, the more she began to feel it too. Maybe she was just an old woman now. Maybe she didn't matter. Maybe that was the way the world worked. When you got older, you were no longer seen, not in the way you used to be, not in the way you had once been valued. She turned her eyes toward the window, the landscape below a blur, as the plane began its steady climb into the sky. She wished she could say she didn't care, that she could brush it off. But she couldn't. Not today, not like this. Eleanor sat quietly in her seat, her fingers gripping the armrests. As the plane soared through the sky, she glanced around the cabin, once more hoping for a sign of kindness. But the faces she saw seemed indifferent, busy with their own lives, their own concerns. No one seemed to notice her, not even Carla, the flight attendant, who had already moved on to another row. Eleanor's heart ached with the weight of being invisible. She had always prided herself on being independent, strong, someone who didn't ask for help unless she really needed it. But today felt different. She felt herself slipping into a place she didn't want to be, a place of vulnerability and helplessness. She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly, and wondered how much longer she could pretend that things hadn't changed so much over the years. She could feel her body growing older, but it was the way others treated her that truly hurt the most. It was as if the world itself had forgotten she was still here. She wasn't some forgotten relic. She had a purpose. Still, she had a family who loved her. But in this moment, it felt like none of it mattered. No one seemed to see her, not really see her. Carla was still darting from one passenger to the next, her movements sharp and efficient. But she never glanced at Eleanor. Not once. The anger that had been simmering inside her started to bubble up. She tried to calm herself, tried to remind herself that she was capable, that this was just a temporary moment, a blip in time. But it was hard to ignore the coldness of the world around her. Her mind kept going back to the same thought. Why was it so hard to be seen, to be treated with the same respect as everyone else? When had she become invisible? Was it the grey hair, the wrinkles, the frailty that came with age? Or was it just the reality of being a senior in a world that didn't care about the elderly anymore? She hated this feeling, hated that she was being pushed aside, when all she wanted was a simple act of kindness, the kind of care that should have been given without hesitation, without having to ask for it over and over. She closed her eyes, briefly trying to compose herself. When she opened them again, Carla was standing by the aisle, once more moving toward her. But this time something was different. The young woman's eyes flicked toward Eleanor before quickly moving away, as if she was trying to avoid looking directly at her. Eleanor's heart sank. She had seen that look before, the look of someone who was trying to ignore something uncomfortable, something they didn't want to deal with. The woman's gaze never lingered on her face, and for a moment Eleanor thought about saying something about how she had been treated, but she held back the words, stayed trapped inside her chest. Her throat tightened with emotion, and she swallowed hard to stop the tears that threatened to escape. She didn't want to be a burden. She didn't want to cause a scene. She had lived her life avoiding conflict and dealing with problems quietly. But now she was tired. She was so tired of pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't, tired of being overlooked, tired of fighting so hard just to be seen. She looked down at her lap, her thoughts tangled in a mess of frustration and sadness, when she felt the sudden urge to speak up, to demand the attention she deserved. But just as she opened her mouth to say something, Carla turned her back and walked away again, ignoring her entirely. The emptiness of that action stung more than anything, the coldness of it, the indifference, as if Eleanor didn't exist, as if she were just another passenger, filling a seat in the sky. Her hands tightened around the armrest once more, the anger now mixing with a sharp sense of humiliation and helplessness. She had hoped to be treated with dignity on this flight, but instead she felt small and forgotten, and in that moment something inside her broke. Just a little piece of her confidence crumbled under the weight of the reality that no one cared enough to help, not even when she asked for it, not even when she needed it most. Eleanor sat there staring at the aisle, her mind racing with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She had never felt so small, so utterly invisible. In all her years of traveling, there was a time when she had walked through airports with confidence, when people noticed her and held the door open, when they offered to carry her bags without her asking. But now it felt like she didn't matter anymore. It was like the world had turned its back on her, and she was just another old woman sitting in a seat on a plane, waiting to get to her destination, waiting for help that would never come. She watched as Carla moved down the aisle again, this time stopping to ask a man in a suit if he needed anything. She could see how carefully the flight attendant spoke to him, how she smiled warmly and made sure he was comfortable. But when Carla's gaze flicked in Eleanor's direction, it was as if she hadn't even seen her. The flight attendant didn't slow down, didn't even pause to acknowledge her existence. Instead, she moved past her quickly and started talking to the passenger in the row behind Eleanor. It was as if Eleanor were a ghost, a shadow in the corner of the plane, and the feeling of being ignored was starting to eat away at her. She had always been independent, always prided herself on her strength, but today she felt weak. She felt like the very air around her was pressing in. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her, why she was being treated like this. But it didn't matter how much she tried to reason with herself, or how much she told herself to stay calm. The hurt was still there deep in her chest, slowly turning into something darker. The hum of the engines seemed louder, now more oppressive, as if they were carrying her not toward her destination, but into the very heart of her loneliness. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her legs aching from the long hours of sitting, her back stiff from the strain. And once again she found herself wishing Thomas was here. How many times had he sat beside her on flights, just like this, holding her hand, reassuring her that everything would be all right. But now she was alone, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear. Just then another moment of silence hung in the air. The plane swayed slightly with the turbulence, but to Eleanor it felt like a moment of calm. Before the storm, she couldn't stay quiet anymore. She couldn't let this continue. Something inside her snapped. She needed to speak up. She had been silent for too long. The injustice of it all was too much. She needed to say something, but the words felt heavy in her throat. What could she say? How could she express all the pain and frustration that had built up inside her over the years? She had been a patient woman, a kind woman, but today she had had enough. And yet, as she opened her mouth to call out to Carla, her voice faltered just as quickly as it had risen. The words seemed to die before they even left her lips. She couldn't bring herself to speak. She didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to be that difficult passenger, the one who caused trouble. And yet the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she deserved better. She deserved respect and dignity, not just as a senior woman, but as a human being with feelings and needs, with a lifetime of experiences that had led her here to this moment. She looked around the cabin again, her gaze sweeping over the other passengers, who were settled in their seats, talking, reading their books, or looking at their phones. She wondered if any of them noticed her, or if they were all too busy with their own lives to care. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. But she refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. She wasn't going to cry, not for this, not for Carla, or for anyone else. She had spent too many years learning how to hold her emotions in check to let them out now. But the hurt was still there, lingering just beneath the surface, the injustice of being dismissed, the loneliness of being ignored. And in that moment, Eleanor made a decision. She wasn't going to let it go, not this time. She wasn't going to sit there and let Carla walk by without speaking up. She wasn't going to remain silent and hope that someone would finally see her, because she knew the truth. No one would see her unless she made them see her, unless she demanded the respect she deserved. So she took a deep breath, wiped away the tears that hadn't fallen yet, and stood up slowly, her hand gripping the armrest for support, her heart racing with anticipation. She was going to do something about this, even if it was the hardest thing she had ever done. Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what she was going to say or how it would come out, but she knew she couldn't just sit there any longer. She couldn't let this moment pass without standing up for herself. Even if it scared her, her fingers tightened around the armrest, and for a moment she hesitated, looking down at the floor, as if the words would come to her there. She could feel her pulse racing in her neck, her throat tight with nerves. But she also felt something else, something fierce and burning deep inside her, the desire to be seen, the desire to be respected. She wasn't just an old woman who needed help. She was Eleanor Davis, a woman who had fought for her place in the world. And she wasn't about to let someone treat her like she didn't matter. The sound of the engines roared in her ears, louder now than before. But it was the silence around her that felt deafening the more. She stood there waiting the more. Her nerves threatened to overtake her. But just as she was about to sit back down and give up, Carla walked by again, this time stopping a few feet from her. She was helping another passenger adjust their seatbelt. As Eleanor watched the back of the young woman's head, she could feel the frustration building again. It was like a dam breaking inside her. All the words she had held in came rushing out before she could stop herself. Carla, she said, her voice cracking just a little. Carla turned around with that same bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. The flight attendant looked at her for a moment before her gaze quickly moved past Eleanor to the rest of the cabin, as if she was trying to move on to the next task. But Eleanor wasn't going to let her this time. She wasn't going to be ignored again. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm now, but still shaking just slightly. Carla looked at her again, her expression blank, but Eleanor could see a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Maybe she had heard the tone in her voice. Maybe she had realized she wasn't going to get away with pretending Eleanor wasn't there. But she didn't say anything at first. She just stood there silently, and Eleanor felt the pressure building in her chest. But she held on to the strength she had found deep within her. "I've been sitting here for over an hour, And no one has helped me, she continued, her voice rising a little, but not enough to make a scene. I've asked for help several times, and you've passed me by every time. Her words hung in the air, like a weight pressing down on both of them. Carla's eyes widened slightly, her mouth opening, as if she was going to apologize, but the words didn't come out at first. Eleanor could see the nervousness in her face, the way she shifted from foot to foot, as if unsure of what to say or do. But Eleanor wasn't going to let her off the hook this time. "No, you don't understand," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't need to be ignored. I'm not invisible. I'm not some old woman that doesn't matter anymore. I'm still here. I still have a voice, and I deserve to be treated with respect." It was like the words had been building up for years of being brushed aside, years of being told she wasn't important any more, years of feeling like a shadow of the person she used to be. Carla's face turned red. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again, and Eleanor could see the regret in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to take back what had been said. It wasn't enough to undo the hurt that had been done. "I didn't ask for much," she added, her voice softening a little. "I just needed a little help. That's all I wanted, a little kindness. But instead, you treated me like I didn't matter." Carla finally spoke, her voice small and apologetic. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ignore you. It's just been so busy," she said. But Eleanor could tell it wasn't just the business that had made her dismiss of it. It was something deeper, something about the way she saw Eleanor as less than her younger, more able-bodied passengers, something about how age had made her invisible to this young woman. But Eleanor wasn't going to back down now. She had said what she needed to say, and even though the apology came, it didn't feel like enough. Not yet, not until she knew Carla understood what she had done. Eleanor waited for her to say more, to acknowledge the weight of her actions. But instead, there was only silence for a long moment, and in that silence Eleanor could hear the subtle hum of the plane as it cut through the sky, and felt a small victory grow within her. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about being heard. It was about showing that even the quietest voice could be strong enough to demand respect. Eleanor stood there, waiting, her breath shallow, as she watched Carla fidget nervously behind her stoic expression. She could see the young flight attendant struggling to find the right words. But for Eleanor, that was no longer important. What mattered was that she had finally spoken up, finally made her voice heard. And in that moment, it felt like the weight of years had been lifted from her shoulders. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and Eleanor felt the eyes of the other passengers on her. She knew they were watching her. But she didn't care anymore. She wasn't going to let fear silence her anymore. She wasn't going to let the shame of speaking up keep her in the shadows, where she had always felt unseen. Finally, after what seemed like forever, Carla spoke again, her voice hesitant and unsure. "I'm sorry, Eleanor." She said, her words softer now, her eyes flicking between Eleanor and the aisle, as if trying to gauge the right way to respond. It was clear she hadn't expected the confrontation, the honesty that had come out of nowhere. But Eleanor wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily. "I'm not looking for your apology," she said, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "I'm looking for understanding. I'm looking for you to realize that I'm not just an old woman sitting here. I'm someone who's lived a life and deserves the same care as anyone else." She felt the tears rise again, but she pushed them down. She didn't need to cry, not now, not when she had already come so far. In making her point, Carla shifted awkwardly on her feet, her fingers nervously smoothing out her uniform. She seemed to be struggling with something deep inside her, maybe guilt, maybe embarrassment. But for Eleanor, it didn't matter. It didn't matter, because this wasn't just about Carla. It was about the way the world treated the elderly, the way they were so often overlooked and discarded, as if their worth had expired. The young woman nodded slowly. "I understand," she said quietly, but Eleanor could see the discomfort in her eyes. It was clear she didn't know how to navigate the situation, how to fix the mistake she had made. And for a moment Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy for her, but it quickly faded. She wasn't here to comfort Carla. She wasn't here to make her feel better. She was here to make sure that no one else would ever have to feel as invisible as she had felt all these years. The flight continued on the hum of the engines and the occasional murmur of conversation filling the cabin. But for Eleanor, the world outside that small plane seemed to fade away. She focused on Carla, watching her every movement, waiting for the young woman to prove that she had really understood what she had done wrong. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that her confrontation had not been just for herself. It had been for all the elderly people who felt the same way she had, for all the seniors who had been overlooked, ignored, and dismissed in their own lives. It wasn't enough for Carla to simply apologize. She needed to understand. She needed to change the way she thought about people like Eleanor, people who had lived full lives and still had so much to offer. Even if their bodies had started to slow down, Eleanor felt a shift inside her, a new sense of purpose, a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She had stood up for herself in a way she hadn't done in a long time. And in doing so, she had rediscovered something deep within her strength, something that had been buried under the weight of time and age. But now it was there, stronger than ever. And just as she thought this, the flight attendant returned to her side. This time her expression was different. It was softer, gentler. And she asked Eleanor if she needed anything else. Eleanor looked up at her for a moment, meeting her gaze directly. She could see the sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't sure if it was because of her own words or the realization of her mistake. But either way, something had changed between them. The young woman wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was truly seeing Eleanor for the first time. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that she hadn't just won a small battle. She had started something bigger, something that could help change the way people treated the elderly. She smiled faintly, feeling the weight of everything she had said lift off her shoulders. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt like she was seen again. Eleanor sat back in her seat, her hands still gripping the armrest. As she tried to steady her breathing, the plane seemed to hum louder, now filling the silence between her and Carla. But there was something different about the air. It wasn't as oppressive anymore. It was lighter, somehow, as though a weight had been lifted. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt a small flicker of hope spark inside her. She had spoken her truth, and it had been heard. She had demanded respect, and she had received it, even if only in small doses. But it was enough. It was a start, and she wasn't going to let it fade away like so many other things had in her life. She glanced out the window, the clouds below soft and wispy, floating like cotton in the sky. And for a moment she allowed herself to imagine a world where she and others like her were treated with dignity, a world where age wasn't something to be ignored or discarded, where the elderly were seen as important, not just for what they had been, but for what they still had to offer. There was a part of her that wanted to believe it could happen, a part of her that still clung to the idea that things could change. But as she turned her gaze back to Carla, she saw that the young flight attendant was still standing a few feet away, her eyes cast downward, as if trying to figure out what to do next. It was clear the conversation hadn't been easy for her, but there was something in her stance, something softer, now something that said she had learned something today. And maybe that was enough. Maybe Eleanor didn't need to change the world in one conversation, but maybe she could start with just one person. The silence stretched on between them again, but this time it wasn't as awkward as it had been before. There was an understanding, there a silent acknowledgement of what had passed between them. And as Carla finally took a step forward, Eleanor saw a shift. Something had clicked inside the young woman, and it wasn't just an apology. It was a genuine effort to connect, to make things right. The flight attendant knelt down in front of Eleanor. For a brief moment, her expression earnest. Eleanor looked into her eyes and saw something she hadn't expected, a reflection of herself. The younger woman's eyes weren't just apologetic now. They were also filled with understanding. "I'll make sure you're more comfortable," she said quietly, her voice steady. "No more rushing past, no more ignoring. You're not invisible to me." Eleanor felt her throat tighten at the simple words. The sincerity in Carla's voice was something she hadn't expected. But it was the first time in hours that she felt like her presence mattered, like she wasn't just a seat filler on a plane, but a person, a human being with worth. She nodded slowly, trying to hold back the emotion that swelled up in her chest. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to her. She didn't need grand gestures. She didn't need anyone to put her on a pedestal. But the acknowledgement of her dignity was something she had craved for so long. She gave Carla a small smile, the first real one she had felt in what seemed like forever. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, but full of meaning. "Thank you for seeing me." Carla gave a small nod and straightened up before she moved down the aisle once again. This time her steps were different. They were slower, more deliberate, and as she passed by the other passengers, Eleanor couldn't help but notice how the flight attendant treated them with the same attention she had given her. It was as if a switch had been flipped, as if she had realized that everyone deserved to be treated with kindness, not just the young, not just the able-bodied, but everyone regardless of age or appearance. Maybe it wasn't just about Eleanor. Maybe it was about something bigger, something that had been buried deep within Carla the entire time. And as the minutes ticked by, Eleanor sat there feeling lighter than she had in hours. She knew that what had just happened wouldn't change the world overnight, but it had changed her world. It had reminded her that she was still here, still capable of making a difference, even in the smallest moments. And that realization filled her with a quiet sense of pride. She wasn't invisible. After all, she wasn't forgotten. She was here, she mattered, and that was enough. The plane began to descend, and Eleanor felt a shift in the air. It was subtle but undeniable, a feeling of change, not just within her, but in the whole atmosphere around her. She glanced out the window again, watching as the ground grew nearer, the city skyline coming into view. But her thoughts were still back on the conversation she had with Carla, her heart still beating a little faster, as if something inside her had finally found its place. For the first time she had stood up for herself, and for all the others like her who had been overlooked, who had been dismissed. Without a second thought, she felt a quiet sense of pride in that moment. It wasn't just about her, it wasn't just about what had happened on this flight. It was about what this moment could mean for others too. It was about showing that no one, no matter how old they were, should ever feel invisible. Eleanor knew that the world wasn't going to change overnight, but maybe, just maybe, this small moment of respect would ripple out and inspire others to do the same. Maybe Carla would remember this experience, and the next time she saw someone in need of help, no matter their age or appearance, she would stop and give them that extra bit of care. Maybe she would pass on what Eleanor had taught her about dignity, about treating people as people and not as faceless figures in a crowd. The thought brought a small smile to Eleanor's face as the plane touched down with a gentle jolt, and the cabin lights flickered on, signaling that they had arrived. She could feel a shift in the energy as people began to stir around her, the hum of chatter filling the cabin once again. But this time it didn't bother her. She felt calm, she felt whole, and for the first time in a long while she felt seen. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she noticed Carla moving down the aisle again. This time her movements were more purposeful, her eyes scanning the passengers in a way they hadn't before. And when she reached Eleanor's row, she paused for a moment to check on her again. Eleanor looked up at her, and the young flight attendant smiled this time. The smile wasn't forced or awkward. It was genuine. There was warmth in it, a real connection that hadn't existed before. And for the first time, Eleanor saw Carla as a person too, not just a flight attendant, but someone who had learned something today, who had been touched by this experience. And it made Eleanor's heart swell just a little bit bigger. She knew Carla had made an effort to change. And maybe that was all she could hope for in this moment, a small act of kindness that would go on to affect someone else, that would inspire another person to care just a little more. And that was something that mattered more than anything. As the doors of the plane opened and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Eleanor stood up slowly, her legs stiff from sitting for so long. But the moment of triumph carried her forward. She walked toward the exit with her head held high, feeling stronger than she had in years. As she passed by Carla one last time, she stopped and looked at the young woman who had made her feel seen and heard for the first time in so long. "Thank you again, Eleanor," said her voice, steady, but full of gratitude. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me." Carla's smile grew wider, her eyes soft with sincerity. "It was my pleasure," she said. And as Eleanor made her way down the jet bridge toward the terminal, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've done something important, something that matters, something that can't be taken away from you. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't a forgotten relic of the past. She was Eleanor Davis, and she was here. And that was enough. She was proud of what she had done today, proud of standing up for herself, and for all the others like her who needed someone to notice, who needed someone to speak for them. And as she stepped into the bustling airport, filled with people rushing to their gates, Eleanor knew one thing for sure: she had made a difference. Even if it was just in one moment, one conversation, she had made the world a little kinder, and that was enough to make all the difference.